West Point, 1910. The United States Military Academy, where America forges its warrior elite. Walk through the granite halls and you'll see the faces that would define the Second World War. There's Dwight Eisenhower, already mastering the art of political maneuvering. Omar Bradley, the quiet strategist with his nose buried in tactical manuals. George S. Patton, Jr., the wealthy Virginia aristocrat who believed he was reincarnated from ancient warriors. These men were polished, disciplined, destined for command. But there was another cadet among them, a man who drank bourbon instead of studying, who settled arguments with his fists instead of words, who loved horses more than regulations and cigarettes more than sleep. His uniform was always slightly wrinkled. His grades were consistently terrible. His attitude was perpetually defiant. His name was Terry de la Meza Allen. Long before the Wehrmacht learned to fear Terrible Terry, the United States Army tried everything in its power to expel him. They failed at West Point, but Terry Allen would prove impossible to stop. This is the story of the general who built 2 elite divisions, defied Patton, infuriated Eisenhower, and revolutionized American infantry tactics, all while being labeled a drunk, a troublemaker, and a gangster. Terry Allen was born to be a soldier, or so genetics suggested. His father, Samuel Allen, was a United States Army colonel. His mother, Consuelo de la Mesa, descended from Spanish military aristocracy. The Allen household in Fort Douglas, Utah, smelled of gun oil and horse leather. Young Terry grew up on cavalry posts, watching his father drill troops in lead formations. War wasn't something distant. It was the family business. In 1907, 17-year-old Terry received his appointment to West Point. It should have been his coronation. Instead, it became his crucifixion. West Point in the early 20th century was merciless. The academy didn't just demand excellence, it demanded conformity. Every button must shine. Every answer must be precise. Every cadet must recite military theory without hesitation. For a young man with a severe speech impediment, this was torture. Terry Allen had a debilitating stutter. When called upon to recite Napoleonic campaigns or define strategic principles, his jaw would lock. Words would jam in his throat. While other cadets delivered crisp responses, Allen would stand red-faced, struggling to force syllables past his tongue. The humiliation was constant. His grades reflected his struggle. Mathematics? Failed. Ordnance engineering? Failed. Military theory? Barely passing. While Eisenhower and Bradley climbed the academic rankings, Terry Allen sank like a stone. But he excelled at what the academy couldn't measure. He could ride any horse, no matter how wild. He could outdrink any upperclassman. And he could fight. Behind the barracks, away from the instructor's eyes, Allen became legendary for his fists. Cross him, and you'd wake up with a broken nose. In 1912, during his sophomore year, the commandant summoned Allen to his office. The message was blunt. "Pack your belongings, Mr. Allen. You are dismissed from the academy." Flunked out. Discharged. Failure. For 99% of men, this would be the ending. Return home. Find work as a clerk or salesman. Dream about what might have been. But Terry Allen possessed something that transcended grades. Pure, burning defiance. He refused to quit. Allen enrolled at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., earned a Bachelor of Arts degree, and then did something audacious. He took the competitive examination for military commission and scored high enough to force the Army to accept him. In 1912, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the cavalry. The Army had tried to get rid of him. Instead, they'd created an officer with a massive chip on his shoulder and something to prove. April 1918, France. While the West Point Golden Boys were managing supply depots and planning staff operations, Captain Terry Allen was knee-deep in the mud and blood of the Western Front. The Great War was in its final, most brutal phase. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest operation in American military history, had begun. Over 1 million American soldiers were hurling themselves against fortified German positions in a desperate push to end the war. The casualties were staggering. Entire battalions vanished in artillery storms. Allen commanded a battalion of the 90th Infantry Division. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, factory workers, and shopkeepers who'd been drafted and given 3 months of training. Many had never fired a rifle before arriving in France. Now they were being ordered to assault German machine gun nests that had been refining their killing efficiency for 4 years. The morning of the assault was gray and cold. Fog clung to the torn landscape like a burial shroud. Allen gathered his officers. No inspirational speech. Just hard truth. The men who hesitate will die. Move forward. Kill everything in field gray. Don't stop. At 05:30 hours, whistles blew. The barrage lifted, and Allen's battalion climbed out of their trenches into hell. What happened next would define Terry Allen's entire philosophy of war. German machine guns opened up. The MG-08 Abai 15s, Devil's paintbrushes, swept across the advancing Americans. Men fell in waves. The attack should have stalled. Standard doctrine said officers should command from positions of safety, using runners to relay orders. Terry Allen ran forward with his men. He was in the second wave when the bullet found him. A German rifleman, maybe a kid no older than 20, maybe a hardened veteran, squeezed his trigger from a concealed position. The 7.92mm round covered 200 yards in a fraction of a second and smashed into Allen's face. The bullet entered through his left cheek, shattered his jaw, and tore out several teeth before exiting. Blood exploded across his uniform. The pain must have been unimaginable. The raw nerve endings of broken teeth, the fractured bone, the torn flesh. His men froze. Their commander was down. This was when units broke, when men panicked and retreated. A normal officer would have collapsed. A normal officer would have screamed for a medic. A normal officer would have accepted the $1,000,000 wound, the injury serious enough to send you home, but not serious enough to kill you. Terry Allen spat out a mouthful of blood, shattered teeth, and bone fragments. His jaw hung loose, connected by torn flesh. Speaking was impossible. But communication is more than words. According to the men who were there, Allen wrapped a bloody bandage around his head to hold his jaw in place. He pulled out his Colt M1911 pistol, and he waved his arm forward. The gesture was unmistakable. Attack! Allen refused evacuation. For 3 days, with his face destroyed and communicating only through hand signals and guttural growls, he commanded his battalion through the Argonne Forest. They captured their objective. They held the line. And when the armistice was finally signed on November 11th, 1918, Terry Allen had earned the Silver Star. The Army brass looked at this blood-soaked cavalry officer with his scarred face and revised their assessment. Maybe they'd been wrong about him. Maybe he wasn't a failure. Maybe he was something far more dangerous and valuable, a pure warrior. But as peace descended on Europe, a new question emerged. Terry Allen had proven he could fight, but could he survive peace? November 8th, 1942, North Africa. Operation Torch. The United States Army waded ashore on the beaches of Morocco and Algeria, green, uncertain, and terrified. These Americans had trained in Georgia and Louisiana. They'd practiced amphibious landings and studied enemy tactics, but they'd never experienced the chaos of combat. They clung to their field manuals like religious texts. Among this sea of by-the-book units, one division stood out like a pack of wolves among sheep, the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and they bore the unmistakable stamp of their commander, Brigadier General Terry de la Meza Allen. Allen despised garrison soldiering, hated parade ground precision, had no patience for officers who valued shine boots over combat effectiveness. While George Patton believed strict uniform discipline created effective soldiers, Allen believed only one thing mattered: aggression. The result horrified the high command. Allen's men stopped shaving. They wore their tunics unbuttoned in the desert heat. They discarded heavy regulation equipment and replaced it with extra ammunition, canteens, and captured German weapons. They walked with swagger, they fought with savagery, and they looked like armed criminals. The British called them Allen's Gangsters. The rear echelon military police hated them, and Allen loved every second of it. "I don't care if they salute," Allen told his officers. "I care if they kill Germans." He was deliberately building a tribal identity. He wanted his men to feel superior to the British, to other American divisions, and especially to Rommel's Africa Corps. The Big Red One wasn't just another unit. They were the elite, the chosen, the best. But this came at a cost. In rear areas, the 1st Division was chaos. They started brawls in Oran and Algiers. They hijacked supply trucks to get better rations. They mocked officers from other divisions. General Omar Bradley, the methodical by-the-book strategist, looked at Allen's division with disgust. He saw an undisciplined mob. Then came the fighting. February 1943, Kasserine Pass, America's first major engagement against the Wehrmacht. German panzers, commanded by the legendary Erwin Rommel, smashed into inexperienced American positions. The U.S. II Corps collapsed. Units broke and ran. American armor burned. It was a humiliating defeat that shook Allied confidence. But when the 1st Infantry Division entered the battle, the German advance stalled. Allen's gangsters didn't break. They dug into the Rocky Hills and fought with savage intensity. They ambushed German supply columns. They counterattacked at night. They refused to surrender ground. The Germans, accustomed to American units folding under pressure, found themselves locked in brutal close quarters combat with men who seemed to take the fighting personally. Because they did. Allen had taught them that war wasn't about following doctrine. It was about being more aggressive, more ruthless, and more determined than the enemy. He spent most of his time at the front lines, not in command tents. He drank with enlisted men. He ignored orders from headquarters if he thought they'd get his soldiers killed unnecessarily. There's a story that perfectly captures Allen's philosophy. During a division review, a staff officer from headquarters complained that the 1st Division's marching was sloppy and their formation lines were crooked. Allen took a drag of his cigarette, looked at the pristine rear echelon officer and said, "My men can't march worth a damn, but they can fight. They don't die easy, and they sure as hell don't surrender." By mid-1943, the Big Red One had become the most effective American combat division in the theater. They'd helped secure North Africa. They'd proven that American troops could stand toe-to-toe with German veterans. But Allen had made powerful enemies. Patton and Bradley watched the gangster general with growing alarm. They saw a commander whose loyalty was to his soldiers first and the chain of command second. They saw a division that identified more with Terry Allen than with the United States Army. They needed the Big Red One's combat effectiveness, but they were already plotting to remove the man who created it. July 1943, Sicily, Operation Husky. The invasion of Sicily was America's first assault on Fortress Europe. The island was defended by German paratroopers, and Italian coastal divisions dug into ancient fortifications. The Big Red One was, once again, at the tip of the spear. The objective? Troina, a medieval mountain town perched on granite cliffs at 3,600 feet elevation. It was the linchpin of the German defensive line, defended by battle-hardened veterans of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. German observers on the heights could direct artillery fire across miles of approach terrain. It was a natural fortress that had resisted invaders for centuries. Patton, desperate for glory and racing British Field Marshal Montgomery to Messina, demanded immediate results. He threatened to sack commanders. He raged about slow progress. But Terry Allen ignored the bluster. He'd seen too many men die in frontal assaults to care about Patton's ego. For 6 days, the battle raged. The temperature soared above 100 degrees. German 88mm guns turned American tanks into funeral pyres. Machine gun fire swept the rocky slopes. It was brutal, grinding combat, the kind that breaks units. Allen orchestrated a masterpiece. He called in waves of P-38 fighter bombers to hammer German positions. He coordinated artillery barrages that turned the mountaintop into a volcano. He maneuvered his infantry company by company, using terrain and darkness to advance inch by bloody inch. On August 6, 1943, the Big Red One entered the smoking ruins of Troina. The German line was broken. It was a magnificent tactical victory. 24 hours later, Omar Bradley summoned Terry Allen to his headquarters. The meeting was cold, clinical, brutal. "Terry, you're being relieved of command." The official reason, combat fatigue. The claim was that Allen had been in combat too long, that he was exhausted, that he needed rest. It was a lie. Everyone in the room knew it. Allen stood there, dust from the Troina battle still on his uniform, his scarred face flushed with anger. "I'm not tired," he reportedly said. "I'm just getting warmed up." But the decision was final. The Army wanted their division back. They wanted to break the cult of personality. Along with Allen, they also fired his assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of President Theodore Roosevelt and a Medal of Honor recipient. The message was clear. Nobody was bigger than the system. The scene of Allen's departure became legendary. Word spread through the ranks. They fired the old man. Thousands of soldiers, men who'd marched through Tunisia, fought at Kasserine, stormed the beaches of Gela, and climbed the heights of Troina, lined the dusty Sicilian roads. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. Many of them openly wept. Allen walked down the line, shaking hands with sergeants, riflemen, and machine gunners. Tears streamed down his scarred face. These were his boys, his gangsters, the finest fighting men in the European theater. And he was being stripped of them because he loved them too much, because they loved him too fiercely. As his Jeep drove away, leaving the big red one behind, it seemed like the end. The Maverick had been broken. The establishment had won. Terry Allen was sent back to the United States, effectively exiled, destined to be a footnote. But the Army had forgotten the lesson from 1912. You can knock Terry Allen down, but you can never, ever keep him down. Fort Lewis, Washington, early 1944. For months, Terry Allen had been in professional purgatory. The newspapers spun his removal as a routine rotation. The Army brass expected him to fade away, to retire quietly, to play golf while the proper generals finished the war. But Allen refused to disappear. He bombarded the War Department with letters demanding a new command. He paced his quarters like a caged predator. And somehow, miraculously, Washington listened. The reason was simple. The war was grinding toward Germany, and the Army was running low on fighters. They had plenty of administrators, but combat commanders, men who could turn raw recruits into killers, were rare. In late 1943, Allen was given the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. This was not the big red one. The 1st Division had been composed of hardened regulars and tough urban recruits. The 104th was filled with draftees, farm boys from Oregon, college kids from California, factory workers from the Midwest. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger. Allen looked at these fresh faces and made a radical decision. He wasn't just going to train them. He was going to rewire their DNA. Allen had spent his exile analyzing the battlefield. He'd reached a revolutionary conclusion. American troops were dying because they fought on German terms. They attacked during daylight when enemy artillery spotters had perfect visibility and machine gunners had clear fields of fire. When darkness fell, American forces stopped, dug in, and slept. Gentlemen, Allen told his staff officers, were going to become creatures of the night. The training regimen he instituted was brutal and unprecedented. The entire division flipped its schedule. They slept during the day and trained at night. They learned to navigate dense forests in pitch blackness without flashlights. They disassembled and reassembled weapons by touch alone. They conducted live fire exercises in darkness, machine gun bullets cracking overhead to inoculate them against the chaos of nocturnal combat. Allen's doctrine was simple but revolutionary: attack without preliminary artillery. Standard American tactics involved massive bombardments that warned the Germans an assault was coming. Allen taught the Timberwolves to advance in total silence, to be inside German foxholes with grenades and bayonets before the enemy even woke up. For months, he drove them relentlessly. His motto for the division: nothing in hell must stop the Timberwolves. In September 1944, the 104th Infantry Division landed in France. The skeptics, Bradley, Eisenhower, Patton, watched closely, expecting Allen to lose control again, expecting indiscipline and chaos. What they got instead was a precision instrument of warfare. Belgium and Holland. Winter 1944-45. German intelligence officers began receiving disturbing reports from the front lines. Defending units were being attacked at night, not with the usual American artillery barrages, but in total silence. German soldiers would go to sleep in supposedly secure bunkers surrounded by minefields, only to wake up with American bayonets at their throats. The 104th Infantry Division had arrived. Allen's night attack doctrine was psychological warfare at its finest. The Germans had grown accustomed to American predictability. Now they faced an enemy that owned the darkness. One captured German officer told his interrogators, "We can hear the other American divisions coming. The ground shakes from their artillery. But you people, you're just suddenly there." The timberwolves became masters of silent infiltration. In the brutal fighting for the Roer River crossings, Allen's men executed nocturnal river crossings that caught the Wehrmacht completely off guard. The discipline required was extraordinary. One cough, one clinking canteen, one accidental rifle shot could doom an entire battalion. But Allen's training held firm. By spring 1945, the 104th was spearheading the Allied drive into Germany. They liberated the concentration camp at Nordhausen, a horror that scarred the souls of men who'd seen years of combat. They took the city of Halle in a vicious 5-day battle, fighting SS fanatics who'd rather die than surrender. Then came the final act. Pushing deep into the collapsing Reich, the Timberwolves reached the Mulde River on April 26, 1945. Advance elements of the 104th Infantry Division made contact with units of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division, the link-up between East and West, the symbolic end of Nazi Germany. Terry Allen stood on the banks of the Mulde, watching American and Soviet soldiers embrace, share cigarettes, and celebrate victory. 2 years earlier, he'd been fired and humiliated. Now, he commanded a division that had fought for 195 consecutive days of combat, had terrified the Wehrmacht, and had helped destroy the Third Reich. Terry de la Meza, Allen never got his 4th star. He never received the press coverage of Patton or the political power of Eisenhower or Bradley. He retired as a major general in 1946 and died in 1969 at age 80, largely forgotten by the public. But to the men who served under him, rank didn't matter. Allen proved something the Army establishment didn't want to believe. You don't need to be a polished diplomat to win wars. You don't need to follow every regulation. You need courage, aggression, and absolute unwavering loyalty to the men who do the fighting. He was the only American general in World War II to build 2 separate divisions into elite fighting forces. The Big Red one would go on to storm Omaha Beach on D-Day. The 104th would end the war deep in enemy territory, having never lost a major engagement. Allen's legacy lives in every modern night operation, every unit that values combat effectiveness over parade ground precision, every commander who leads from the front instead of from behind a desk. The Germans feared him because he taught Americans to fight like predators instead of administrators. His soldiers loved him because he valued their lives over his career. The army brass tried to break him, but he was unbreakable, forged in the mud of the Argonne, tempered in the deserts of Africa, and proven in the frozen darkness of Germany. Terry Allen was the gangster general, the rebel, the fighter Patton couldn't control and Bradley couldn't break. And that's exactly what made him great.